Russia and Ukraine are now well into their 9th month of fighting, and whilst both sides are still receiving military aid from their allies, the global community is turning their focus on trying to get away from the battlefield and onto the negotiating table. The US is leading the drive to get both sides talking, having admitted that they are in communication with Russia in order to de-escalate the nuclear threat. This comes as the United States' representative to the UN said that they will only enter negotiations with Ukraine in the driving seat. But both sides are seemingly unwilling to talk, with Russia still attacking Ukraine's eastern front and its capital Kiev, and Zelensky saying that Ukraine will not give a centimetre to Russia. So are negotiations, or even the process to reach negotiations, a losing game? Can either side afford to hold out for much longer? Will foreign influence disrupt any chances of negotiations? How will the Russia-Ukraine war end?
So let's get to it. How will the Russia-Ukraine war end? As always, let's begin with this quick fire round of 30 seconds each, and then we begin the debate right after. So Thomas Much, please take the lead.
So I want to say that had Ukraine followed the advice of many pessimistic commentators back in February or March, it would have had to negotiate away large parts of its sovereign territory and accept extraordinary restrictions on its ability to conduct commerce and foreign policy. And I'm very glad to say that now it looks like if Ukraine goes back to the negotiating table, they're going to be in a very powerful position, being on the military front foot with a stream of stunning victories.
Wow, and now we will dive further into that in a split second. Michael Tracy, your thoughts?
I would question the premise that the United States is meaningfully encouraging Ukraine to commence any negotiations. The Washington Post reported just a few days ago that when the Biden administration urged the Zelensky government to modify its stance on the potentiality of talks with Putin, it was only doing so for the sake of PR, meaning to put out a better image of Ukraine's intent rather than to actually facilitate substantive negotiations.
Well, honesty, mediation, war, it's quite difficult to illustrate clear lines between those terms. Amir Oren, last but not least.
Every war must end, and if there's no unconditional surrender or a decisive victory, some compromise will have to be found. And the United States has already poured some $20 billion into the Ukraine assistance program. It too wants it to end. We will probably see whatever happens on the ground consolidated, frozen during the ceasefire and the talks.
Or because of winter. So let's begin the conversation, and please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Thomas Much, I do want to begin with you. Major developments in Kherson this evening. What does the Russian withdrawal mean?
Well, it's a pretty significant symbolic and territorial victory from Ukraine. Kherson was Vladimir Putin's biggest prize that he had taken since February, and for them to lose a city that just several weeks ago they had declared would be eternally part of Russia is a rather humiliating blow. And it means that Ukraine is actually able to sell the continuation of war and to prove that it is using the weapons and the money it is receiving in aid to do what it needed to do. And this is, I think, a point that's important to make. All that American or Western aid has not been going to waste. Ukraine has shown it can use it for exactly the purposes it's intended for.
And Michael Tracy, let's go back to this changing Western rhetoric. Not if negotiations, but rather when. Is the clock ticking backwards for Kyiv, and can Kyiv really push back on any American pressure to engage in negotiations?
I simply don't see much evidence that there's really been a change in posture in the so-called Western attitude, at least as it relates to the United States. Again, after Zelensky issued a presidential decree several weeks ago affirming that no negotiations would be possible with Russia so long as Putin is in power, which effectively meant that there would need to be regime change in Russia before any negotiations could take place, the United States only sort of impelled Ukraine to modify that stance ever so superficially. And just a few days ago, I think it was yesterday, the new stated position of Ukraine is that negotiations would have to be pursuant to territorial integrity being reestablished, which means that apparently it's not on the table to make any sort of meaningful concessions, at least territorially. So, I mean, the United States is basically continuing the same posture it's had this entire time, which is effectively abandoning negotiations, only pursuing military options, and escalating in the intensity of the intervention that the U.S. has undertaken. I mean, at the beginning of the war, it was never communicated to the American people that the United States was essentially going to be funding, arming, and operationally coordinating a potential offensive by Ukraine to seize Crimea. But now Zelensky and his fellow government officials explicitly state that that is their intent, and the United States continues to at least insist publicly that they're going to defer those strategic priorities to Ukraine. So now American taxpayers are paying the bill for a fairly maximalist military strategy that is well beyond the contours of what was initially described back in February.
Amir Oren, are you identifying any shift in rhetoric, let it be in Washington or in Brussels? And by the way, the EU just pledging 18 billion euros to Ukraine over the next year, perhaps setting the post-war stage, or still very much engaged in the ongoing battlefield?
Well, Ellie, when you fly across Ukraine, east to west or west to east, you see the Dnieper traversing it, and while it doesn't cut it neatly in half, nevertheless, it does portray the country as West Ukraine and East Ukraine. Now, the Russian war aims at the beginning were not realistic. If they wanted regime change in Kiev, obviously their military was too cumbersome to achieve it. So now they have downgraded their whole operational strategy in order to keep at least parts of East Ukraine. If there is no secret channel, one cannot conceive that for the last 9 months there has not been any secret talks, some mediation, in order at least to get some framework of the issues when, as Secretary William Rogers once said, stop shooting and start talking.
And in this respect, are we witnessing this Russian catch-22 of sorts? The greater the Russian military losses, the greater the desire to achieve a victorious image, or simply put, is the nuclear option rather becoming more realistic the graver the Russian military situation on the ground is getting, Thomas Much?
So one thing I have to say is when you say things that are, stop shooting and start talking, it's a very nice phrase. However, you go into the history of military negotiations, that's almost never the case. Actually, very often the fighting escalates as you start negotiating, as both sides are eager to get a military advantage going into those negotiations.
Or final gains. Yeah, we know it well enough here in the region, and endless rounds of fighting between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Immediately before a ceasefire is supposed to get intact, you see a barrage of rockets, like a finale to this or that operation. But back to the Ukrainian story. Michael Tracy, months of Western sanctions appear to be taking their toll more on global economy than on Russian economy. Can we say it was perhaps a failed strategy here?
Well, it certainly hasn't achieved what the policymakers who imposed those sanctions claimed it was supposed to achieve from the outset. But one of the benefits of running the U.S. foreign policy apparatus is that failure is never an impediment to just pressing onward with the same strategy. And very seldom are people in the administration or Congress held to account for the failure of their prognostications. In terms of the rhetorical posture of the U.S. in this potential sense that there's been a shift. I think more pertinent is to examine the actual actions of the U.S. And in Congress, there's a defense appropriations bill, the annual defense appropriations bill, now being deliberated. And recently inserted into that bill on a bipartisan basis by two prominent senators is a provision that would actually revise some of the procedures around procurement within the Pentagon, meaning contracting processes, so as to expedite and accelerate the furnishment of armaments to Ukraine. So the Congress and the administration are bearing down for an even longer term military commitment to this war. And if there might be on the surface some minor changes in rhetorical posture that really don't amount to much, I think it's nowhere near as significant as the actual tangible actions that are being taken, which should suggest that the U.S. is all in on this military commitment, especially actually on a political level after these midterm elections in the U.S., which I think, fallaciously cast as potentially meaning that Biden would have to change course on Ukraine if the Republicans took sizable majorities. That hasn't happened. I mean, I don't think Republicans were going to withdraw aid anyway. But now it can be seen as vindication for the status quo, and there's every reason to believe that Biden is just going to barrel on forward despite the ever increasing escalation and despite the risk to Americans.
And say, look, I disagree with Michael on an awful lot, but I do think he has a point when it comes to the fact that this shift may be more just rhetoric than actual substantive action. But I do want to say two things. One is that, sure, the sanctions might not have worked quite to the extent we thought they would, but the U.S. military aid, as it has just been proven on the battlefield over and over, in Kharkiv, in Kherson, in other places, have worked. Also, American voters just had the chance to deliver a repudiation to the ruling party, of which its Ukraine policy was very much on the ballot, and they decided not to do that, it seems, as the results are coming in.
Well, Ellie, one misses a Henry Kissinger with some view of grand strategy, which if you take your eyes off the issue at hand, the Ukraine war, one should look ahead. If China is the pacing rival or adversary of the United States, as is now the idiom used by policymakers, then is it in the interest of the United States to see Russia bleeding rather than trying to attract Russia into the American orbit, as far-fetched as it might sound right now? Looking ahead, a Russian-American rapprochement with China as a common rival might be in the common interest of both Moscow and Washington.
The Thucydides trap taking it, making waves in geopolitical strategy. Years later. Okay, we're taking a quick break on that note and back with the rest in a split. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Michael Tracy, Thomas Mocha, and Amir Oren. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, and no doubt that aside, of course, from bringing good to the world, there is great prestige in being a mediator in great conflicts, and if successful, of course. So let's first take a listen to this and pick up the conversation right after.
You've been saying you want to be a bipartisan kind of figure in the country.
I've always been able to do that. I got a lot of bipartisan stuff passed you guys never thought I'd get passed.
Are you worried about Ukraine aid with the Republicans in charge of the House?
Yeah, I am worried about that because they said they'll cut it.
So let's get to it. Another quick round of 30 seconds each. Should global leaders interfere at all? Amir Oren, take the lead, please.
Well, it's not interfering. They should help the warring sides get some face-saving formulas in order to get the common interests translated into some compromise, some deal. Now, obviously, each leader, both Putin and Zelensky, must come out with something to show their domestic audiences. For instance, Zelensky must get something in the way of NATO accession, which Putin, of course, would resist. But if Putin gets some territorial gains, it might compensate for the other thing.
Okay, we'll unpack it further in a split second. Michael Tracy, your take?
Well, this idea that American voters had a chance to repudiate the current policy status quo with regard to Ukraine at the midterms is just a fallacy. And Biden actually articulated a version of it there. The House Republican leadership, including Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, Elise Stefanik, the people who were predicting a much more rousing victory last night, and who still may wield the majority, if anything, they've been critical of Biden for being too lax in supporting Ukraine. So there was never a meaningful distinction between the two parties, even though there was a confabulated political narrative to suggest that Republicans wanted to somehow suddenly cut off aid. That was just never what they actually expressed if you listen to the rhetoric and the positions that were espoused.
Yeah, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene, not a single penny for Ukraine is something that continues to resonate. Yeah, of course, marginal within the GOP frameworks. Thomas Much, your thoughts?
So one thing that I've said from the start is I don't think there's a meaningful contradiction between the idea of supplying Ukraine with heavy weapons and military aid, and also pushing for a negotiated peace so that Ukraine can be in the strongest position it possibly can on the negotiating table. We have to admit that in almost every way between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine is the aggrieved party. Now, I would actually take a slightly different view that it would be possible that Ukraine could be able to compromise on NATO accession, but I think polls overwhelmingly show that almost all Ukrainians greatly resist any territorial concessions to Russia.
And in this respect, and please feel free to interact, Michael, what could be an agreed upon starting point for negotiations? Can there be any settlement without territorial concessions?
Well, I think any starting point would have to begin with an acknowledgement of reality in a forthright, non-obfuscatory way. I mean, the mantra coming out of the Biden administration, coming out of Congress for months, has been this slogan, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, that Ukraine are the only ones who get to determine the strategy. The United States is not going to impose on Ukraine. But obviously the power dynamic in this arrangement is such that it's the United States which is making the determination to supposedly defer authority on these matters to Ukraine. I mean, the United States is almost singularly funding and militarily supplying the entire Ukrainian war effort. They're even basically underwriting the basic functionalities of the Ukrainian government, even paying salaries to state workers and pensions and so forth. So it's the United States which wields the power in this situation. And if any negotiation, so to say, is actually going to be forthcoming, they would have to, you would think, drop the pretense that somehow Ukraine has the ultimate agency here to make these ultimate strategic or military decisions. No, it's the United States which is making these determinations fundamentally.
Michael, if I may interject here a moment, I'm not even saying you're necessarily wrong there. However, and I've asked you this personally, what does a negotiated settlement look like? Can you answer that sort of question? If you're pushing for these negotiations, what do you think that Ukraine should give up territorially? What do you think issues like reparations or the return of deported people should look like? You can't just say that America needs to push for negotiations if you have no idea what those negotiations are going to look like.
I'm not advocating for any particular framework for negotiations. I'm simply observing and emphasizing that I think it should be more honestly reckoned with, that the United States, as a matter of plainly evident policy, has stymied and abandoned the mere notion of negotiating this entire time. I mean, Lloyd Austin, I'm sure you remember this, went to Ukraine in April and declared that the objective of the United States was to, quote, weaken Russia. Joe Biden went to Warsaw, Poland, and basically declared in an unprecedented statement in March that Putin should be ousted from power. I mean, these are not the sentiments that would be expressed by a country that actually wanted to facilitate negotiations. They're trying to facilitate a military defeat.
Right.
And
Thomas?
that's ongoing.
Yeah, Thomas, please.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I'm saying you're talking about Ukraine being an American puppet or whatever. That's not actually the question the topic that we're trying to discuss. You are so keen on these negotiations. Can you please tell the audience here, what do these negotiations look like? Does Ukraine have to sign off the entire Donbass or the entirety of Crimea forevermore? Should there be some kind of negotiated fudge on the status of Crimea while Donbass returns with a devolution settlement? What does these negotiations that the Americans have to push for, what do they actually look like on the ground? Where's the detail?
Well, I didn't use the word puppet. I mean, would you deny that the United States is ultimately the prime mover in this situation as the chief organizer of the entire military effort? Remember, they're not just funding and arming the Ukraine military. They're operationally coordinating the combat missions of the Ukraine military, including the so-called counteroffensive that was launched in August and September. So I don't personally have a document or a dossier outlining the nature of a conceivable negotiation framework. However, the United States government is the one that would have to take the lead in even beginning the process of entertaining such negotiations, and the policy orientation of the U.S. government since the war began has been the total antithesis
to lead the
of
way.
that. If negotiations are to be forthcoming, the true nature of what the United States policy has been needs to be actually clarified. At
Thomas, please.
May I interject for a moment?
Please, Amir.
The actual nature.
Allow me for a second to close or at least blink the global eye and speak for the parochial Israeli interest, because after all we are speaking from Tel Aviv, Jaffa. The more the war is prolonged, the worse the situation is for us here, because just like the Syrian civil war, where Russia came in the fourth year, here the Russian-Iranian alliance is getting stronger, and it's against everyone's interest except perhaps Tehran and Moscow. So better for, first of all, a truce, a ceasefire, to be set for humanitarian and other reasons, and then to hash out the various ideas when the guns go silent.